Welcome to today's Explainer. We are taking a really structured, unflinching look at a topic that touches on a long, deeply complex, and honestly often misunderstood history. We're directly addressing the premise that Jewish people hold outsized money and influence. Now, it's a persistent generalization for sure, but as you'll see, it actually points back to a real historical phenomenon that requires some careful, objective unpacking. Our goal here today is absolutely clear. We need to separate the historical facts from the dangerous fictions.
Okay, let's dive into this. Why does the wealth stereotype persist? It's an idea that has survived for literally centuries, and to understand exactly why, we have to completely deconstruct the myth, piece by piece. We're going to answer two totally distinct questions in this explainer. First, what are the actual historical reasons why Jewish populations entered certain financial professions in the first place? And second, what is the modern reality of wealth and influence today, completely independent of those distorted stereotypes?
So, Section 1. The roots of a stereotype.
To answer that first question, we need to take a trip back in time to medieval Europe. Because to truly understand this, we have to start with the actual, documented historical realities of the past. The story of Jewish involvement in finance, it doesn't start with some inherent cultural affinity for money. It actually starts with strict, non-negotiable religious law. Take a look at this concept. Usury. Back in medieval Europe, the Catholic Church strictly prohibited Christians from lending money at interest. They considered it a severe sin. But, and here is where a massive legal loophole comes into play, this prohibition simply did not apply to non-Christians. So, Jewish people, who were already a minority living under Christian rule, found themselves in a highly unique economic situation. Because of this specific religious law, they became one of the very few groups who could legally engage in money lending. And remember, lending was an absolutely essential economic activity for society to function and grow.
Which brings us to Section 2, Forced into Finance.
Now, what's really interesting about this slide is how it shows that entering finance was not a cultural preference or a choice for Jewish people back then. It was a matter of strict necessity, rigid legal boundaries, and sheer survival. The systematic exclusion was intense. Christians were banned from usury, yes, but Jewish populations faced incredibly severe barriers of their own. They were systematically excluded from owning land, and in a feudal society, land was the absolute primary source of wealth and status. On top of that, they were widely excluded from joining most craft guilds. So they were essentially blocked from all traditional forms of feudal wealth building.
When you were barred from agriculture and trades, you're pushed into the few occupations left open, mostly petty trade and money lending. I mean, think about it. When entire avenues of survival are closed off by law, you take the paths that remain. It's so crucial to look at this fact with empathetic objectivity. The historical occupation of finance wasn't some kind of master plan. It was the direct result of severe discriminatory restrictions. It's a really stark contrast to the modern myths surrounding this history.
Moving on to Section 3. Diaspora and Court Jews. Over the centuries, these early legally forced economic roles actually began to shift into far more prominent, highly visible financial positions. Over time, some Jewish financiers became practically indispensable to European royalty and nobility. They became known as court Jews. They managed the finances of kings, funded royal armies, and secured luxury goods. But by doing this, by making themselves so incredibly vital to the ruling class, they inadvertently planted the very seeds for future stereotypes. It created this highly visible public association between Jewish people, finance, and institutional power.
Simultaneously, there was another massive geographical factor at play here. Jewish populations were scattered globally in what's known as the diaspora. Because they were so dispersed, they naturally maintained these deeply trusted family and community networks across different borders. Long before the modern global banking system ever existed, these trusted international networks were perfectly positioned to facilitate early international trade and the cross-border movement of money. The Rothschild family is usually the ultimate historical example cited for this exact phenomenon.
All right, let's jump into Section 4, the modern reality.
So, the world today is obviously completely different from medieval Europe. The legal restrictions of the past are long gone, and Jewish people are finding incredible success in fields ranging from science and medicine to law, the arts, technology, and academia. So what's actually driving this huge, diverse success in the modern era? Well, it basically comes down to two main pillars. First, leveraging historical momentum. The skills, the networks, and the experience in commerce that were built out of necessity over centuries, they didn't just vanish. They were leveraged into the modern era of banking and capitalism. Second, and this is absolutely crucial, there was a massive post-Enlightenment cultural emphasis on education, literacy, and professional careers. It's this deep cultural push for learning that led to genuine success across so many diverse, high-earning fields, far beyond just finance.
Now for Section 5, the fallacy of control.
This brings us to a critical pivot. We've looked at the genuine history, but now we need to actively and definitively deconstruct the core of the anti-Semitic conspiracy theory that still circulates today. And we're going to do it using hard data. So the crucial point is 0.2%. Just let that number sink in for a second. Jewish people make up only about 0.2% of the entire global population. That's 2 out of every 1,000 people. It is absolutely vital to ground ourselves in this tiny statistic when anyone starts discussing global influence.
Now, despite being such a tiny fraction of the global population, Jewish people are concentrated in specific countries, like the US and Israel. And statistically, they are overrepresented in certain fields, like Hollywood, academia, or law. But listen, this is entirely due to historical immigration patterns and that deep cultural value of education we just covered. It is not a conspiracy. However, this demographic concentration can create this totally false illusion that Jewish people are somehow everywhere, which directly fuels the fallacy of outsized influence.
We really need to draw a stark contrast here to shatter this illusion of a unified bloc. On one side, you have the myth, the idea that the Jews act as this single, highly coordinated group controlling global money. On the other side, you have the modern reality. Jewish people represent a vast range of political views, economic interests, and cultural identities. Look, a billionaire banker and a poor immigrant might share a religious or cultural heritage, but they absolutely do not share a unified, coordinated financial agenda. They are entirely distinct individuals.
And this brilliantly illustrates the tragic distortion of history. On one hand, we had the historical reality, individuals succeeding out of pure necessity, overcoming legal restrictions and leaning into a drive for education. On the other hand, we have the dangerous myth, a sinister, all-powerful cabal which was popularized by completely fabricated classic anti-Semitic texts like the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. The inherent danger here is that a tiny, tiny kernel of historical truth, the fact that some Jews were legally forced to be financiers, was twisted into a completely false and devastatingly tragic scapegoating mechanism.
Let's lock in our conclusion today with this thought. This success is real, but it is the success of individuals, not a coordinated group. This is the ultimate takeaway from all the sources we've examined. We can clearly acknowledge the real historical factors that legally mandated certain economic roles, and we can absolutely acknowledge the modern successes across a whole diverse range of fields. But individual achievement should never, ever be mistaken for a global conspiracy. The idea that Jewish people control the world's money just completely ignores the vast diversity of the population and the deeply complex historical reasons behind their roles in society.
Which leaves us with this final, incredibly powerful question. How easily is history weaponized into scapegoating? This myth has been used for centuries to blame a specific group for society's incredibly complex problems, and almost always with tragic consequences. So as you step away from this explainer today, I invite you to reflect on the real-world dangers of these stereotypes. And I challenge you to actively question the historical generalizations you encounter out there in the world. Thank you so much for joining me, and as always, keep learning.